Hi, my name is Alex Casano, and I'm the events coordinator here at the Clearwater Historical Society, and today we'll be having Sharon Lamm. She'll be speaking about North Pinellas County history, so I hope you enjoy this presentation. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sharon Lamm. I first moved to Palm Harbor in May of 1975, so I have lived here more than 45 years. I would like to tell you about some of my memories of those days and just what it was like then in that unincorporated area. Then in July of 1978, I began working as a reporter and writer in the Clearwater Bureau of the St. Petersburg Times, which is now the Tampa Bay Times. I worked there for 17 years, covering religion and entertainment for the north part of Pinellas County, from Seminole north to Tarpon Springs. I also covered the city of Oldsmar for a while, as well as what we called general assignment, which means a little of anything and everything. I want to tell you about some of the people that I interviewed, especially those relating to Palm Harbor, as well as some events, organizations, and places that I wrote about. If you've been to the Disney park called Epcot and walked to the back area with pavilions representing the different countries and stopped at France, you probably watched the featured film, which has been shown since Epcot opened in 1982. It begins as if you are floating on a boat down a lovely river with beautiful nature scenes on both sides. It's very calm and peaceful, with beautiful music in the background, and it is called Impressions of France. Today, I invite you to join me on my imaginary boat as we glide back in time to the year 1975, and I would like to share with you my impressions of Palm Harbor. I remember Palm Harbor as a peaceful, small downtown with a handful of stores and businesses. The beautiful post office we have now didn't exist. The post office was in a storefront on Florida Avenue, where a dentist office is now. Palm Harbor in the mid-70s was a quiet town with many orange groves and some cattle pastures. There was no Pinellas Trail. Instead, a freight train still announced its arrival with a loud whistle each afternoon and once during the night. The train tracks ran alongside what is now Palm Harbor Boulevard, alternate US 19. The first house I lived in was just a few hundred feet from the tracks, and we loved to see the train go by each day. After the trains quit running in the late 1980s, the tracks eventually became the Fred Marquis Pinellas Trail. There was no bustling traffic as we know it today in Palm Harbor then. Dirt roads were giving way to paved streets, and a handful of subdivisions were popping up. Countryside Mall was just being built and opened in September of that same year. The Hood orange juice processing plant made downtown Dunedin smell like orange blossom perfume. I was here as the orange groves were slowly abandoned, making way for more subdivisions. For a few dollars, you could visit the Noel's Ark Chimp Farm on alternate 19 in Palm Harbor to see the chimpanzees, monkeys, a gorilla, and more, and dodge whatever they threw at the people watching them. After many renovations and improvements, it is now reopened as the Suncoast Primate Sanctuary. There was no Palm Harbor Library when I moved here. It officially began 3 years later in a small storefront on Omaha Street. Jeanette Maloof, then a teacher at Ozona Elementary School, began collecting paperback books in her home so the students would have something to read during the summer when school was out. Over the years, through her efforts, support from the community, and some grants, the current beautiful Palm Harbor Library came to be. There was no Palm Harbor University High School, no Eastlake High School. Palm Harbor students went to Tarpon Springs or Dunedin high schools. There were no Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That team began in 1976, a year after I moved here. There was no Rays baseball or Lightning hockey. There was Highlight in Tampa, a game from the Basque regions of Spain and France with 2 players in a 3-walled court. I attended a few games, but I can't even begin to explain how the game is played. Begun here in 1953, it ended in 1998. There was horse racing at Tampa Bay Downs, and the original Rowdies played soccer from 1975 to around 1985, and incidentally, the Rowdies soccer has been revived in recent years. One of my favorite memories of those early days in Palm Harbor was the Easter Sunday morning sunrise service, staged at the intersection of Florida Avenue and Omaha Street. We carried our folding chairs in the early morning darkness to the flattest spot on Florida Avenue, just before it intersected with Omaha Street. From that point, Florida Avenue climbs upward to the east, creating a fairly steep hill over which the sun would rise. Background scenes had been created by a local resident, painted on huge panels. Local folks acted out the various scenes: Jesus' triumphant arrival in Jerusalem, riding a live donkey, prayer before he was arrested, the trial and scourging, Jesus and the soldiers making their way up the incline of Florida Avenue to the top of the hill, where a cross bearing the actor portraying Jesus was hoisted up into the air just as a blinding bright sun rose over Florida Avenue. Somehow the timing was always perfect for that moment. The sunrise service was sponsored by a group of local churches. I don't know exactly when it began or when it ended, but I remember the excitement waiting for the Passion Play to begin, buying hot chocolate from the scout troop, and the occasional mishap. Even though the streets were blocked, once a car came driving slowly down Omaha Street, right in the middle of the presentation, the driver totally unaware of what was happening, the crowd surprised into silence as the vehicle slowly passed through. Sound effects were pre-recorded, and once the volume of a rooster's crowing after Peter denied Jesus 3 times was turned incredibly loud and startled the crowd as it rang out. But overall, the Easter morning sunrise service was pretty awesome, inspiring, and memorable. There was no Palm Harbor Chamber of Commerce when I arrived. It started 2 years later in 1977. Over the years, I've participated in many chamber programs and events, including serving as chairman of the board of directors in 2000-2001. But the most rewarding was the Leadership Palm Harbor program sponsored by the chamber in the late 1980s. That's where I met my husband, Kurt. He had recently retired to Palm Harbor as a colonel after more than 23 years in the Army. We've been married now for 29 years. Kurt had 2 sons when we married. Clint, who is now Director of Pre-Clearance for Customs and Border Protection, a division of Homeland Security. He works in Washington, D.C. and lives in Burke, Virginia, with his wife and 2 sons, our grandsons, ages 13 and 15. And Chess, who retired in December 2017 after serving more than 21 years in the Army. He and his wife, Ashley, now live in Odessa, and their daughter, our granddaughter, is now 20 and a junior at USF in Tampa. During my time in Palm Harbor, incidentally, I've lived in only 2 houses. The first was just off Alternate 19, just a few blocks from historic downtown area. I lived there from 1975 to 1995. Kurt and I were married in 1991, and in December of 1995, we moved to Landsbrook in the East Lake section of Palm Harbor, and we've lived there in the same house since 1995. 2 of the first people that I met soon after arriving here were Bill and Louise Hoskins. Bill was an internationally known artist who was teaching art at a local school in Clearwater. He and his wife Louise had opened an antique store across Omaha Circle from that early post office I mentioned. They were friendly and welcoming and became my dear friends for many years. Bill had studios upstairs where several local artists worked. It was a delightful place to visit in the middle of this quaint little town, which actually was home to a surprising number of artists. Bill and Louise Hoskins organized and ran the first Palm Harbor Arts, Crafts, and Music Festival, staged in the downtown streets in December of the same year that I arrived. Bill was friends with many other artists who came to participate in the early shows, not just from Pinellas and Hillsborough counties, but from all over Florida and other states as well. The art show thrived for many years, and later generated funds each year to provide a $1,000 scholarship for a local high school senior who planned to attend college and major in the arts. And I have a couple of articles that I wrote in those early days. This one is November of 1978, $5,000 pledged for the Art Center. Bill Hoskins, Palm Harbor artist, had a dream for this hometown of his, a dream he's been working on for quite a while now. Thursday morning, another part of the dream came true. Chamber of Commerce President Frank Weiner, also chairman of the board and president of the Palm State Bank of Pinellas, of Palm Harbor, made a surprise personal pledge of $5,000 to create an art and cultural center in Palm Harbor. I have studied art, and I realize that Mr. Hoskins is a fine artist, Weiner said. He has great potential, and I realize what he can do for Palm Harbor. Hoskins was elated at the pledge. I've wanted this, an art center, for a long time, he said. And then in December of 1979, I had written a story about the Art and Music Festival. And I'll read you just a little of that. With clear skies overhead and a coolness in the air, more than 1,000 spectators were already checking out the Palm Harbor Art and Music Festival only a half hour after it officially opened Saturday. The two-day show was open from 10 a.m. until dusk Saturday and will be open the same hours today. Obviously, this was written on a Sunday. The different exhibits were all kinds of artists. There was print, fabric artists, pottery, jewelry, everything you can think of. So that was a big hit in those early days. One local artist was my across-the-street neighbor at the time, Marjorie Woodhouse, who made tiny sculptures and small paintings and helped begin the local branch of the International Miniature Art Society, the Miniature Art Society of Florida, founded in Clearwater in 1974. The group still presents annual shows with artists from all over the world. I wrote a story about Marge Woodhouse feeding the pelicans off the docks behind her home. She would call them, and usually 15 to 25 would fly in and settle in the water and sometimes in her yard, waiting for a chunk of food. And here is a story I wrote about that. At chow time, there's a line at the seawall. Marjorie Woodhouse has a special place in her heart for pelicans. She has become quite well known in artistic circles in the past few years for her metal sculptures of pelicans and other seabirds, built drop by drop from a solder of tin and lead on a base of molten lead. And when the waters in Sutherland Bayou behind Mrs. Woodhouse's Palm Harbor home become too cold for the pelicans to find food, she feeds the large brown birds from the seawall. They fly in from all over the bayou when she goes out with a bucket of thawed fish. If they're frozen, the fish get stuck in the birds' pouches, she said. For the past 3 weeks, Mrs. Woodhouse has been purchasing 100 pounds of Spanish sardines each week from a local fish market. A few friends have donated money to help pay for the fish. That's not much for 30 to 35 pelicans each day, she said, but at least it keeps something in their tummies. Another early acquaintance was Terry Fortner, who has been a much-loved friend ever since. Terry is the granddaughter of Myrtle Betts, who was born and grew up on Caladesi Island. Myrtle wrote a book, Yesteryear I Lived in Paradise, at the age of 87, about her life growing up there on the island. And that's an incredible story in itself. Myrtle's book has been reprinted several times, and I was fortunate to have assisted in proofreading and editing each edition. In addition to overseeing the publication and promotion of her grandmother's book with a presentation called Caladesi Memories, Terry is extremely active in the Pinellas County community, working with historical and preservation groups. She is quite involved with the Palm Harbor Historical Society, having served as president, and with the Palm Harbor Museum. So just by chance, or perhaps divine guidance, I moved into a house near where Myrtle lived in her later years, and I met her granddaughter Terry. Before working for the Times, I wrote human interest stories part-time for a small local paper, the Suncoast News, at the time. Since Terry knew lots of people in Palm Harbor, I often consulted her to get ideas for people to interview. And since Terry already knew many of these local residents, I sometimes took her along on my interviews. Myrtle Betts passed away on a Friday, January 3rd, 1992, at the age of 96. It was my day off, but my editor knew that I was close to Myrtle, and he called me in to write her obituary. I will share that with you. Myrtle Sharon Betts, who shared her memories of growing up on Caladesi Island, surrounded by nature and wildlife through her book, Yesteryear I Lived in Paradise, died Friday at Suncoast Hospital. She was 96. Mrs. Betts was born in 1895 on Caladesi Island, now a state park, later lived in Miami and Dunedin, and most recently made her home in Palm Harbor, where she lived for more than 30 years. Mrs. Betts' book, written purely for the family and purely from memory, according to her introduction, originally was published in 1985 and was revised in 1991. It tells the story of her father, Henry Scherer, who came from Switzerland in 1883 and homesteaded 156 acres on the southern half of Caladesi Island, then called Hog Island. Miss Betts' mother, Catherine, died before Miss Betts was 6, so she was brought up by her father on the island, growing their own food and providing for their needs independently of the mainland. When she was almost 9 and old enough to row across the bay in a small skiff each morning, Miss Betts attended school in Dunedin. She was married in 1915 to Herman Betts and moved from the island permanently when their only daughter, Marion, was old enough to attend school. I never was more heartbroken in my life than when I left there, Miss Betts said at a celebration in her honor in November of 1990. Incidentally, proceeds from the sale of Myrtle's books have provided scholarships for a number of local students and have been used for various projects on Caladesi Island. Two more people that I met in those early days were Charlie and Winona Jones, who were very involved with Palm Harbor Museum and donated many hours to preserving the history of the area. Both have now passed away, but Charlie was a contractor and Winona was a high school librarian, and both made many contributions to this area. I met Charlie immediately after a community prayer breakfast at Innisbrook, which I was covering for the newspaper. I drove a small sports car, a Triumph Spitfire at the time, and as I got ready to pull onto US 19, leaving Innisbrook, I committed that unpardonable sin of starting to pull out and then stopping again. Charlie behind me saw me start to go, looked the other way, and pulled out too, crashing into the back of my car. He was driving Winona's car at the time. Fortunately, no real damage was done since he was driving very slowly, but it made a great story to tell for years to come. I met Winona through a local branch of an international service club for professional women, the Pilot Club of Palm Harbor. The local chapter was active for about 10 years. We worked on all kinds of projects together, including donating a flagpole and planting trees in Pop Stancil Park, sponsoring a U-Park home in Palm Harbor, and providing tape players and books on tape, yes, this was a long time ago, to local residents who needed them. After membership decreased and the club disbanded, 5 or 6 of us continued to meet for dinner every few months. We called ourselves the Palm Harbor Executive Women, or the PHEW, few, except Winona always jokingly called us the Pew. We remained very close until her death. Are you still with me on my imaginary boat? Let's float on up to 1978, when I began working as a reporter and writer in the Clearwater Bureau of what was then the St. Petersburg Times, now Tampa Bay Times, and I worked there for 17 years. What led me to journalism? When I was a little girl, I read a lot. I read a lot of books, and my older sister had one book called Brenda Starr, Girl Reporter. And it was an illustrated hardback book about this young woman who was a reporter but always managed to get into all kinds of scrapes and adventures. She had long flowing red hair in the book, in the diagrams. And since I had red hair, I thought, yes, I want to be just like her. So that was kind of what started me on my career in journalism. Writing was always easy for me, and I was encouraged by my teachers. I was the editor of my high school newspaper and of my college literary magazine. I participated in the North Carolina Press Association's summer intern program for 2 summers before my junior and senior years in college, and I worked both summers for local newspapers in my hometown. I was hired by the St. Pete Times in 1978 to cover general assignment and religion in North Pinellas County. And each Saturday I had a column of events as well as a feature story about a local congregation, a minister arriving or leaving, a new congregation beginning, or some church event. I also wrote about the city of Oldsmar, both official meetings and other stories. A year or so later, an entertainment page called Diversions was added on Fridays, and I wrote a column of events for that as well. And a feature story each week on a local entertainer, a club, a restaurant, special event. As I wrote about both religion and entertainment, people said that I covered sin from both sides. And I will show you a sample. This is a sample of the religion page, which these papers are very old, but that included a feature story, as you can see, about Dr. James P. Gills. He founded St. Luke's Eye Clinic in 1968, developed the Trinity Communities in the 1980s, and I interviewed him at the time of this story about his latest book. He wrote many, many books and probably is still writing them, and he always gave them away in at the eye clinic. One of the religion stories that I featured was about a business in Palm Harbor called Truckin' for Jesus. Truckin' for Jesus. They transported huge trucks of produce and other items, and on every truck was big letters that said Truckin' for Jesus, so everyone in Palm Harbor knew. And I interviewed Bob Stancil in 1979 about why he named the business Truckin' for Jesus. Bob Stancil says he knows there was a mechanical reason for the bright lights that suddenly came on as he was moving into his new Palm Harbor trucking office. But at the time, he felt it was a religious experience. Because of that feeling, he vowed to dedicate his business to God. In September 1977, Stancil's trucking business was being moved from the corner of Illinois Avenue and U.S. Alternate 19 to a new location farther north on alternate 19. Stansel was alone in the office and had the door propped open to let the light in, since the electricity had not been hooked up. However, the electricity was being hooked up at that very moment. Suddenly the lights came on. It startled Stansel so much that he fell to his knees, he said. The Holy Spirit came over me, he said. At that time, Stansel believed the light to be a sign from God, and he decided to dedicate his business to the Lord immediately. The slogan, "Truckin' for Jesus," is printed in huge red letters on the main building. Inside, in the reception area, religious tracts and a Bible are displayed. Over the receptionist's desk, a painting depicts a trucker driving a dark road with the figure of Jesus superimposed, guiding the driver. A sign that reads, "Welcome home, drivers. We are glad you are back," greets the truck drivers as they return from each trip. A morning devotional period is held every day for those employees who wish to attend. Bob Stansel is president of H.L. Stansel Incorporated. The company was begun in 1925 by his grandfather, Henry S. Stansel. At first, the company hauled fruit, but later hauled seafood, produce, plants, flowers, bathroom fixtures, floor tile, and steel. With 55 trucks and 130 employees, the company was still growing. Stansel attributed the company's success to God. "He has blessed us," Stansel said. And of course, Stansel's trucking building is gone, no longer there. They moved over closer to the interstate, I believe. Over the 17 years that I worked for the St. Petersburg Times, I covered 17 Epiphany services. My job was to cover the church service. I didn't get to do the fun stuff like going down to the bayou and watching the young men dive for the cross. I sat in the church, and I had to go very early to get a seat because it was absolutely packed. Very crowded, very close, and the smell of incense was pretty strong too. So I had to get a seat and sit there for a couple of hours before the service even started. And that was, for 17 of those was enough. The Epiphany means the manifestation of Jesus as the Son of God. Some considered it when the wise men or the three kings visited the baby Jesus. Others consider the Epiphany to be when Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River. It's celebrated on January 6th and marks the end of the 12 days of Christmas. So that was a small sampling of the religion stories that I wrote over the years. I'm going to show you now a couple of the diversion pages. And a second one, just to give you an idea. There's also a feature story each week, as well as a list of activities and events and things going on in the community. And this wasn't just Palm Harbor, this was the entire North County. So, in the entertainment world, there were so many shows, festivals, bands, restaurants, performers, and plays. Here's one of my favorite leads to the entertainment page. What fun it is to sit in a darkened theater just as the curtain rises, the music begins, and the actors take their places on stage. Whether it's a play you've never seen or one you know so well you can quote entire passages, there's a special excitement at that moment when the show begins. 4 local stages will come alive with performances this week, offering selections varied enough to appeal to a wide range of interests. So choose your favorite or try all of them, but get out there before they bring the curtain down. So that was just the lead into a story I did about several plays opening in the area. As far as some of the entertainers that I interviewed, one that you might recognize the name is Johnny Cash. In 1987, I wrote a story about, and maybe you knew this or didn't, Johnny Cash wrote some books. So he was having a book signing at a local bookstore. 300 Johnny Cash fans walked the line Wednesday evening in order to spend about 30 seconds face-to-face with the country singer and songwriter. The line snaked through a bookstore in Countryside Village Square, which isn't there anymore, where Cash signed record albums, photographs, baseball caps, and even an acoustic guitar. He scratched his name into the guitar with a screwdriver, as well as copies of his latest book and first novel, Man in White. Dressed in his trademark black, Cash spoke politely to each person waiting in line to see him. "He's always like this," said Cash's manager, Lou Robin. "In the 18 years I've been with him, I've never seen him turn anyone down for an autograph, no matter how inconvenient it was at the time." Cash wrote his autobiography, Man in Black, in 1975. Man in White is a fictionalized account of the life of Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul. The book includes information from the Bible and Cash's ideas about what Paul's life was like. I also interviewed Glenn Campbell. It wasn't really necessary for the tall, attractive stranger with the boyish face to say, "Hi, I'm Glenn Campbell," to the patients he visited at Morton F. Plant Hospital Tuesday morning. They recognized him immediately, their faces showing surprise and disbelief before the wide smiles appeared. The singer is in the area for the J.C. Penney Golf Classic at Bardmore Country Club in Seminole. Since Morton Plant Hospital is one of the beneficiaries of the tournament, arrangements were made for Campbell to visit patients in several wards and the business area of the hospital. Campbell was clean-shaven and dressed in a brown and gray striped suit that accentuated his broad shoulders. He wore a light tan, open-collared shirt. He said he began visiting hospitals during the mid-1960s and has frequently visited VA hospitals. Working for charity and visiting hospitals cleanses the soul, he said. He hurried to several wards to meet patients. Nurses and visitors lined the hallways, many asking for autographs. Lots of giggling and a few quiet screams marked Campbell's passage through the wards. Campbell talked and joked with the patients, especially the children. Sandy Church, 17, of Largo, asked Campbell why he was there. "I came to see you," he replied. Also wrote several stories about Bertie Higgins, who's a local Tarpon Springs singer-songwriter who became really internationally famous. I understand he was very well known in Japan, but he wrote the songs Key Largo, Just Another Day in Paradise, several songs that became national hits, international hits, I guess. And then he used to perform locally, so he had a lot of other songs that we heard as well. I also covered quite a few Renaissance festivals, which is a recreation of a 16th century English village. Many of you have probably been to the Renaissance Festival locally. It was quite an amazing experience at several different locations over the years, but always a fun thing to do. Good food, funny people, just a really good time. The miscellaneous stories that I have covered over the years. One in, both of these are in 1979. This was about a waterfront park for Palm Harbor. Residents of this fast-growing unincorporated area of Upper Pinellas County will have their own waterfront park in the not-too-distant future. Financing for construction of the park will come from Pinellas County's Community Development Block Grant Program. Members of a subcommittee of the Citizen Advisory Committee of Palm Harbor will determine what goes into the park. The park will be located in 2 waterfront blocks bordered by Florida Avenue and Indiana Avenue on Sutherland Bayou. The land was donated to the county by Robert L. and H.L. Stansel of Palm Harbor, that was the Trucking for Jesus owners, with the understanding that it would be used to build a park for Palm Harbor residents. Once it is developed, the park will be maintained jointly by the Palm Harbor Civic Association and the Greater Palm Harbor Chamber of Commerce. And the same year, Palm Harbor youngsters to have soccer field, organized leagues. So in 1979, the organized soccer leagues began in Palm Harbor. And I'll read you just a couple paragraphs of this. Children in Palm Harbor are enthusiastically polishing up their soccer skills this summer as they get ready for the September opening of a new recreation field for their area. The field will be at the intersection of County Road 94 and State Road 584, just beside the new Lutheran Church of the Palms in Palm Harbor. The church has agreed to donate 4 acres of land for $1 per year for 3 years to the Palm Harbor JCs. The JCs are sponsoring the building of the field and the organization of the Palm Harbor Youth Recreation League. The field will have 2 soccer fields, 1 large and 1 small, and a softball field. So those fields are still, I believe, in use. I wanted to show you a sample of the press passes that I used at the St. Petersburg Times. You probably can't see these very well, but in the press passes, I went from Sharon Kirby to Sharon Lamm. And when I left the St. Petersburg Times, the other writers and the editors put together a mock diversions page. So they wrote it just as if it was one of my features each week. But they made fun of my hair, which started, I don't know if you can see, it started kind of flat. So they put together this page showing different pictures I had used over the years with my column. As the hairstyles changed, I changed with them. And that was one of the things they did on my last day. It's funny to read about the different things that people said about my leaving. They tried to make it sound a lot worse than it was. And in conclusion, Palm Harbor remains an unincorporated area within a very densely populated county. It still has the quaint small-town atmosphere and neighborly feeling of community. So let's bring this imaginary boat back to shore and come back to dry land again. I hope you have enjoyed my presentation of Impressions of Palm Harbor. Thank you.